As she enters the home stretch of the presidential race, Vice President Kamala Harris is pitching her policies to voters.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Okay, let's get to business. Let's get to business. All right.
She talked more about her plans for the economy and immigration at the Democratic National Convention. But she has been vague about one key area: big tech.
I will make sure that we lead the world into the future on space and artificial intelligence, that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century, and that we strengthen, not abdicate, our global leadership.
And Harris being cautious in how she talks about the tech industry is not surprising to people who've been following her career.
So Kamala Harris is a politician who came up in Silicon Valley's backyard. She is someone whose political rise has been fueled by key tech figures who have become some of her primary donors. And she's someone who has a long track record of working on issues around social media and artificial intelligence.
That is Kat Zakreski. She reports on national tech policy at The Post. She and our colleague Cristiano Lima-Strong recently looked into Harris's deep personal and financial ties in Silicon Valley and how big tech's power has shifted among Democrats.
One thing we've seen is really a sea change in the Democratic Party's relationship with the tech industry over the last decade. You had President Obama, who was widely seen as a tech optimist, who worked very closely with people in Silicon Valley, frequently hosted them at the White House for events and conversations. Over the last 4 years, we've seen something totally different under President Biden. It's been a much more antagonistic relationship between this White House and the tech industry.
Under Biden, the government has launched legal attacks against titans like Google and Apple. So the question is, if elected president, will Harris remain a hardline against one of the world's most powerful industries? Or could we see a Harris administration that's more hands-off?
There's a chance that she might be, given these personal connections, financial connections to the industry, more friendly to them. And that could create a situation where these tech companies could grow more powerful, and perhaps there would be fewer limits on their ability to collect users' data, protect them from harmful content, and generally address other concerns that the American public has had about these businesses.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, September 4th. Today, I talk with Kat about Kamala Harris's long-standing ties to Silicon Valley and how they could influence her approach to big tech if she wins the presidency. So, Kat, I want to go back to when Kamala Harris's political career first started in California. Give me a sense of her relationship with Silicon Valley, and particularly Silicon Valley's elite, back at the beginning parts of her career.
So she is someone who has long been in the social circles of some of the most powerful people in the tech industry. I mean, if you go back, she's someone who was at, big weddings of tech executives. She's someone who...
Like who?
Sean Parker, the founder of Napster, who famously had a big wedding that there was a lot of controversy over. She and Gavin Newsom were among the California politicians who attended that more than a decade ago.
Wow.
There were instances where early in her political career, venture capitalists had some of the first fundraisers for her when she decided to make her bid for Senate. She has long appeared at events alongside other big tech CEOs. And so she has a very different relationship with these figures and these companies than what we've seen from someone like President Biden or former President Trump.
Well, I also think it's interesting to think about that time period of like the late aughts around 2010. I mean, that's a period that I remember. You know, if I met someone at a party who worked at Google or Facebook, I was like, wow, that seems really cool. Like, what a cool job to work there. And obviously, our thinking about these tech companies has changed a lot since then. But like, tell me about this era when Harris was having this somewhat cozy relationship with these tech executives and the environment in which she was crafting these relationships.
So it was a period of intense techno-optimism, especially within the Democratic Party. You saw Obama in 2008 really embraced social media to fuel his presidential campaign. There was a lot of excitement around social media as a force for spreading democracy around the world. People talked about its role in events like the Arab Spring. And you really just saw this excitement around these companies and what they were doing for the American economy at a time where there was growing concern about Wall Street and other economic powers in America.
So then Harris goes from being a district attorney to actually being California's attorney general, and then, of course, went on to become senator from California. During those years, how did we see Harris's relationship with big tech shift or not shift?
So we've seen both when she became California Attorney General and then when she moved on to the Senate that she did take a tough line with the companies on contentious issues. And one area that really has come through is on sexually explicit imagery online. She really is someone who became concerned about a phenomenon that at the time people were calling revenge porn, instances where people are taking sexual images and using them in ways without people's consent. And I think that's a representation of kind of the approach she took to these companies as a bit of a pragmatist. She was very clear-eyed about some of the risks involved with these businesses and their growing power and influence over society, but at the same time had a deep personal connection and understanding of how they worked. One instance where I thought this really came through early in her political career in Washington was when we saw the Cambridge Analytica hearings back in 2018.
I've been here for on and off for the last 4 hours that you've been testifying, and I have to tell you, I'm concerned about how much Facebook values trust and transparency.
When we talk about tech policy, that was such a big moment when Mark Zuckerberg, now it seems like these tech CEOs are in DC all the time, but it was so rare then for one to be hauled to the Hill. And she, at a time when other lawmakers were really struggling to understand how Facebook worked, how it even made money, she displayed a really deep understanding of the platform and asked them questions like the prosecutor she is.
They told us they had testimony in that regard, but I'm talking about notification of the users. And this relates to the issue of transparency and the relationship of trust, informing the user about what you know in terms of how their personal information has been misused. And I'm also concerned that when you personally became aware of this, did you or senior leadership do an inquiry to find out who at Facebook had this information, and did they not have a discussion about whether or not the users should be informed back in December of 2015?
So it seems like this was an interesting moment for Harris, that publicly she's grilling people like Mark Zuckerberg. There are certain issues when it comes to tech regulation that she's taken a stand on, but also privately, she has these relationships with tech executives. She is very much of this world. Can you talk about specifically when it comes to tech monopolies and antitrust cases? That was a big part of how the government was starting to think about how they were going to regulate big tech. And as Harris was starting to think about running for president, as she started her first presidential campaign, like, what is your sense of where she stood on that issue and how much she was influenced by her personal relationships with big tech?
So this was a moment, if you think back to the 2020 Democratic primary, you had Elizabeth Warren come out and say, here's my plan to break up Meta, Amazon, and other big tech companies. And that really started this debate within the Democratic Party about where do candidates stand on this important way of addressing the power of these companies. And so Harris always had a bit of a muddled view on this issue. It wasn't one where she took as clear of a stand as some of her opponents in that Democratic primary. We saw her come out and, say that at one point we need to take a serious look at the power of Meta.
There is no question in my mind that there needs to be serious regulation and that has not been happening. There needs to be more oversight. That has not been happening.
But when she was asked about whether she supported breaking up the companies, she pivoted to saying her first priority, if she were to be in office, would be addressing data privacy issues.
My first priority is going to be that we ensure that privacy is something that is intact.
We didn't see a clear stance from her on antitrust enforcement. And it came at a time where some of her biggest supporters were board members and investors in some of the companies that would be most affected by more aggressive antitrust enforcement.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that because, these are not just personal relationships she has with, big tech investors in terms of going to their lavish weddings or whatever, but these are donors to her campaign. Like, they are giving her money that is allowing her to run for office. Talk a little bit about the presence of these tech executives in the pool of people who are giving Harris major donations around that time period as she's in the Senate, as she's running for president for the first time, and the questions that raised about whether those donors were influencing her views on tech regulation.
Sure. So, some of the tech figures who were involved in hosting and bundling for Harris included Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn, which was purchased by Microsoft. He sits on Microsoft's board. You had Laurene Powell Jobs, who is a philanthropist who is also the widow of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. You had Ron Conway, one of the most prominent early stage investors in many of these tech companies. These were all the types of people that were kind of, helping introduce Harris to figures throughout the tech industry. And, at the same time, one other key person in the mix is her own brother-in-law, Tony West, who has, been very close to Harris throughout her career. And he is in a key general counsel role at Uber.
Oh, wow. So what questions did that start to raise about the influence of these kinds of high-powered donors?
Harris has deep ties and connections to business and was tasked with representing those companies and their founders in Washington for years. And now she's at a different moment as she seeks the White House, and she's trying to balance how does she manage those longtime relationships and interests with the growing concerns in the country about the power of these companies and the ways they might be negatively affecting our lives.
After the break, how the Harris campaign is navigating President Biden's more hardline approach to tech giants. We'll be right back. So let's get into Kamala Harris as vice president. During Joe Biden's presidency, she has taken on a leading role when it comes to shaping tech policy. What is her stance and the Biden administration's stance when it comes to tech regulation, and what stood out during her tenure as vice president in terms of her interactions with the tech world?
So the Biden administration has taken a much more aggressive posture toward regulating the tech giants than what we've seen in the past. Certainly Biden, through his appointment of people like FTC Chair Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor to the Department of Justice, has really handpicked people who will play a very aggressive role in bringing lawsuits against these companies. At the same time, we've seen action from the administration. If you look at the executive actions they've taken on tech, probably the biggest signature push was the artificial intelligence executive order that Biden signed last year. And Harris really was the face of that. I remember traveling to the United Kingdom last year in November when Harris visited to talk about the administration's approach to regulating artificial intelligence.
President Biden and I believe that all leaders, from government, civil society, and the private sector, have a moral, ethical, and societal duty to make sure that AI is adopted and advanced in a way that protects the public from potential harm, and that ensures that everyone is able to enjoy its benefits.
She appeared at a summit where many other tech executives, including Elon Musk and Sam Altman and other global leaders like United Kingdom Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and officials from China and other EU countries, all gathered to talk about how do we deal about this problem of artificial intelligence. And you saw in her remarks her attempt to both take a clear-eyed approach to what the risks are of this technology, but also to promote how it could potentially be really beneficial to society and improve healthcare and improve, challenges. And so in that way, you see instances where she's kind of saying a little bit of what everyone wants to hear.
Interesting. So then when it comes to her campaign for president, what are the questions that people have about her relationship to Silicon Valley and to tech donors and the people that she's brought onto her campaign team?
There are major concerns about her inner circle and the powerful individuals within it who also are playing a key role in defending major tech companies from litigation. One that has really raised a lot of scrutiny, including from her opponent, Donald Trump, is Karen Dunn. So Karen Dunn is a key advisor to the Harris campaign. Our colleagues at the Post have reported that she's intimately involved in prepping Harris for the debates. She's also a key lawyer defending Google from its landmark antitrust litigation against the Biden-Harris administration. So you see that there's people...
So this is a person who's currently a lawyer for Google and is defending a case that the U.S. government is bringing against Google and is also now currently advising Harris on her campaign.
Exactly. And these are kind of the, awkward relationships that you see throughout her inner circle and advisors.
Yeah. And seems to bring up some, pretty clear conflict of interest questions, at least. Like, has the Harris campaign or Karen Dunn herself said anything about whether there is a conflict of interest here?
They have not publicly responded to questions from me about this.
Okay. And it seems like this is raising some pretty important questions now because, as you pointed out, the government is in a completely different place than it was 10 years ago in terms of its relationship with big tech. And it seems like a lot of people are wondering now, with all these people in Harris's political world who are part of the tech world too, who have her back, who are giving her money, like, Will she return the favor? Will she become a president who ends up being soft on big tech or veering away from some of these more aggressive measures to regulate tech companies? Do you have an answer to that question? Like, what is your sense of what Harris would be like as president if she were to win when it comes to her relationship with tech companies and how she would think about the government's role in cracking down on tech companies?
So one thing I'm seeing right now is the campaign is really avoiding some of these questions, I think in an attempt to keep this really delicate coalition together ahead of Election Day. This is really a situation for Harris where she's trying to balance both the more moderate, business-friendly wing of the Democratic Party with some of the more populist ideas and policies that we see rising on the left. And I think, one area where this has been most clear this election cycle is the question of what happens to Lina Khan. And so, for some of you who have listened to Post Reports before, we've talked about Lina Khan as kind of the person who Biden appointed to lead this revolution in how we regulate the tech industry. She's been at the helm of the Federal Trade Commission and brought a landmark antitrust case against Amazon.
What we want to make sure is that these markets are open and competitive and fair.
This is actually tape from an interview we did with Lina Khan earlier this year.
And what that means is that if you have a company that is similarly trying to prevent customers with benefits in the marketplace, that they should be able to compete on the merits. And what our lawsuit alleges is that Amazon has, through a whole series of tactics, basically maintained its monopoly through shutting out rivals.
And she has strong supporters, very interestingly, on both sides of the aisle, right? There are Democrats and Republicans who are like, yeah, we like that Lina Khan is coming after big tech and trying to break up these monopolies.
Yeah, notably, J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, has talked about how Khan is his favorite person in the Biden administration. And so, you see that kind of strange bedfellows emerging. And so we haven't seen a clear answer from Harris on what Khan's future would be if she were elected president. And I think that kind of speaks to this general uncertainty about what's going to happen. When you talk to people, you hear a lot of wish casting, right? When I talk to venture capitalists and lobbyists, they're really optimistic. They've had these relationships with her for a while. They know, we're not necessarily going to go back to exactly how things were under Obama, but they're hopeful they'll have her ear at least and that she'll hear them out.
And not all of this is behind the scenes, right? There's reporting that Reid Hoffman, as you mentioned, who's a major Democratic donor and an ally of Harris's, that he has called on Harris to fire Lina Khan if she's elected. It's been very explicit. He
explicitly called for that in an interview with CNN.
Lina Khan is a person who is not helping America in her job and what she's doing. And so I would hope that Vice President Harris would replace her.
So this is not, private backdoor dealings. You saw other venture capitalists and business executives come out and agree with him. And so certainly this is happening in plain sight. And so that is kind of the question moving forward. How much do these longtime supporters, allies, and friends of her win out and really influence her policy on these issues moving forward?
And of course, you have been looking at these questions around Harris and her campaign because she, has so many donors from the tech world, because she's coming from California and has had an opportunity to really work with Silicon Valley over the years. But I do think it's important to understand at the same time where former President Trump and his campaign fit into all this. You mentioned his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who also has ties to the tech world. Can you just describe, in what ways are there similar or not similar concerns about the Trump campaign and our sense of what the tech industry's relationship is with Trump?
Sure. one really notable thing is that Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, is a former Silicon Valley-based venture capitalist himself. So he has deep ties and financial relationships with Peter Thiel and other prominent venture capitalists who have increasingly been realigning themselves with the Republican Party. And what I would say is, although, we see both Trump and Harris kind of navigating how do you address these concerns about big tech while at the same time court support from key executives and donors in the industry and balance existing personal relationships, we've seen Trump more blatantly kind of try to win powerful figures in the tech industry over to his side. I mean, certainly he hosted a Twitter Spaces recently with Elon Musk. He went and appeared on the All In podcast, which is a popular podcast run by some venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And at the same time, though, you have Trump aligned with Vance, who, despite these personal relationships, has kind of crafted himself as a populist. And so while he supports, some of these more hands-off approaches to cryptocurrencies, he also has called for more aggressive antitrust enforcement of the tech companies. He's voiced his support for Lina Khan. And I think that raises the question of, we'll see a very complicated relationship no matter who is in the White House, because you have this attempt to respond to the American public's growing concern about the, outsized power that these companies have in their daily lives, while at the same time, there are strong financial interests and personal relationships that will inevitably have an influence on the path forward.
Yeah, it just seems like a really complicated and delicate time in terms of the relationship between the political world and the tech world. And that's true in some ways for everybody.
It's exactly right. And, this is all coming at a time where technologists are telling us that artificial intelligence is going to get more and more powerful and affect more and more aspects of our daily lives. And there's a really intense debate about what to do about that. And it's clear that no matter who is in the White House, there will be these close connections to the tech industry that will likely have a say in that.
Kat, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on, Martine.
Kat Zakrzewski is a national tech policy reporter for The Post. Our colleague Cristiano Lima Strong also reported on this story. The Post is also reporting on other stories today that I'm following, including a shooting this morning at Appalachia High School, northeast of Atlanta. The attack left 4 people dead and at least 9 more hospitalized. Officials say that the shooter is in custody. Also, it's a critical moment in the war in Ukraine, where Russia has launched a series of new attacks. On Tuesday, at least 50 people were killed and hundreds more were injured when missiles struck the city of Poltava, hitting a military institute and a hospital. It was one of the deadliest attacks of the war so far. This renewed push by Russia into Ukraine comes as there's been a reshuffling within the Ukrainian government. At least 7 high-level officials have resigned in the last few days, most prominently the foreign minister. This is one of the biggest shakeups we've seen under the leadership of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And
I care about my family. I care about equal rights of everyone in this country. I care about all this. And, as much as I stayed as an independent, I decided that, it was time to move on and do what I believe in.
In an interview on CNN on Tuesday, Jimmy McCain, son of the late Arizona Senator John McCain, said that he has changed his voter registration from independent to Democrat, and that he would be supporting Kamala Harris. McCain, who has served in the military, also spoke about a controversial visit to Arlington Cemetery by Donald Trump last week. There were multiple reports of an altercation there when members of Trump's campaign staff defied requests from cemetery officials to not take photos or videos near the graves. Trump has denied that there was any altercation. But nonetheless, McCain criticized Trump's visit.
It's a violation because these rules are set in place. The people who are buried there don't have an opinion. The point of Arlington Cemetery is to go and show respect for the men and women who have given their lives to this country. When you make it political, you take away the respect of the people who are there.
That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you are looking for another way to go beyond the headlines and dig in on the news, I have a recommendation for you. Impromptu from The Washington Post, where you can hear opinions columnists have frank, thoughtful conversations on the cultural debates of the day. This week's episode is about what men want, the crisis of disconnection, loneliness, and a lack of role models facing American men, and the dueling visions of masculinity on the political stage.
I think there's this concern that when any of us says something like men need to provide for their family and protect them and give them security, we immediately think that that's right-coded. Oh, conservatives say that. And that's, I think, that isn't the way it should be. These things should be available for all people, all Americans.
Right. Absolutely.
You can find Impromptu wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Sabby Robinson, with help from Peter Bresnan. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky and edited by Monica Campbell and Ariel Plotnick. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.